about the organization of the local church and how the Lord desires that congregations have elders. We have studies and have had studies about those qualifications of elders, about the qualifications God requires for a man to be able to serve as an elder in his church. But what I want to do this morning is not focus on elders specifically, nor focus on the congregation specifically. We're going to deal with both of those today. But what I want to talk about for a few moments here this morning is about elders in the local church. We want to look at how the church is to be organized, what we mentioned at the beginning, how what God demands for the organization of the local church. But then we're going to talk about the responsibilities that elders have towards the local church. And then we're going to take it and go the other way. What are the responsibilities the local church has towards elders in the church? That's what we want to talk about for a few moments this morning, to elders and the local church. I would encourage you, go ahead and turn to Philippians 1. We're going to be going there momentarily. Follow along with me this morning as we study together. Again, Philippians chapter 1 will be where we began. Test what I have to say to see that it be the truth. I hope we find it to be. We can take and use it in our everyday walks of life. As we talk about the local elders in the local church, let's begin, as we said, with the organization of the local church, the organization that God requires in His church. Go again, if you haven't already, to Philippians chapter 1 and in verse 1, where it says, Paul and Timothy, bondservants of Jesus Christ, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi, with the bishops and deacons. Now, Paul here, though the passage is a greeting, gives us the organization of the local church. It's not the only passage, but it gives it to us in a very precise or concise package here in Philippians 1. Again, other passages will, talking about the local church, but a wider range of text. But as we talk about the organization of the local church, there are three groups that are mentioned here. The first of those, they're called bishops here in Philippians. That means an overseer. That's an elder. Now, the elders, the bishops, they're called shepherds. They're called a number of terms. So we're just going to simply use the term elders. But as we go through passages this morning talking about the responsibilities elders have, or the responsibilities a congregation has towards elders, we're going to see a variety of terms that may be used. It may simply be called the ones that rule over you in the Lord in some text, but a number of terms will be used. But elders are in the organization of the local church. The local church then requires deacons who serve under the elders. The deacons are assigned the jobs by the elders. That word deacon having to do with the idea of being one that is a servant. And then the third group is the saints. That's the members that are not serving as deacons nor are serving as elders. Those are the three groups mentioned in Philippians 1. Our focus this morning is on the responsibility that's had from the elders towards the congregation. That would include deacons and saints, and the responsibilities that the members have towards elders. Now, those things may change. One serving as a deacon, they are assigned jobs specifically by the elders and other things. But what we're talking about this morning is responsibilities the elders have towards the whole of the congregation, or the congregation as a whole has towards the elders. Now let's talk about the responsibilities of elders to the local church. What are the responsibilities that God has given to elders towards the local church? Well, first and foremost, God requires that they examine themselves and they examine the flock. Go to Acts chapter 20. In Acts chapter 20, this is one of those texts where we hear about learn about elders. In Acts 20, Paul is addressing the Ephesian elders. This is his farewell address to them. He's going to write a letter later to the church at Ephesus while in prison. But in Acts 20 and in verse 28, Paul is part of Paul's speech to them here, where they came to him at Miletus. And in verse 28, he said, Therefore, take heed to yourselves and to all the flock among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church of God, which He purchased with His own blood. And so, the first thing he says is take heed to yourselves. We're going to talk about the responsibility elders have in a minute towards the members in taking heed or examining. But elders have to start first by taking heed to themselves and examining themselves. Am I in the faith? And then, after examining themselves, then they can examine the flock and say, are they living in the faith? That's part of the job of elders, is to look at the flock, to make sure that they are living in harmony with the will of God. They give an account for that. It's not an easy job they have to examine the flock and make sure that they're living in harmony with the will of God. So elders need to first examine themselves and then examine the flock. Another responsibility of elders, and we're going to be moving rather quickly. We've got a lot of responsibilities on both sides to cover this morning. But another responsibility of elders is to shepherd or feed the flock. In 1 Peter 5 and in verse 1 it says, the elders who are among you I exhort, I who am a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that will be revealed, shepherd the flock of God which is among you. So they're to shepherd the flock. Some translations will use the term feed the flock. So when we talk about this idea of shepherding the flock, the term here, it means a figurative extension of meaning. To shepherd, to lead, with the implication of providing for, to guide, and to help. And take care of. The idea is you're taking care of those. For Matthew 2:6, you will come a leader who will guide you. From you will come a leader who will guide you and help my people Israel, quoting Matthew 2 and in verse 6. The idea is that they're to lead or provide for. That's what Leonidas says the word means. That's why the King James, that should be, opts for feed. Some translations say feed the flock. Talk about feeding instead of shepherding the flock in these passages using the term shepherd. They don't say feed the flock. They say shepherd the flock. Why do they say, or they don't say shepherd, they say feed. Why? Because a large part of shepherding the flock, taking care of, is making sure the flock is properly fed. Part of the jobs of elders is making sure that the congregation is getting the spiritual food they need to be. Whether that's by direct teaching, them doing teaching, or by making sure that whoever is doing the teaching is dealing with things that need to be dealt with, they're making sure the flock is to be fed. Acts 20 and in verse 28, in the passage we looked at earlier, also uses that term shepherd. Shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. So what are the responsibilities of elders to the local church? Well, number one, examine yourselves. Make sure you're in the faith, but examine others to make sure they're living right. Take heed to yourselves in the flock. Examine and warn. Shepherd or feed the flock. Make sure they're getting what they need spiritually. Here's a third one. Set an example for the flock. In 1 Peter 5 and in verse 3, 1 Peter 5 and in verse 3, nor as being lords over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. So they're not to be lords over those entrusted to them. We'll come back to that later on. But to set an example to the flock. It's not about, here I'm in this position of authority and I'm going to lord it over you, but I'm setting an example. You should be able to take and say, listen, look to the elders and the kind of life they live. That's the kind of life you need to lead. In reality, when you go to 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1, there are a few that are exceptions, but the vast majority of the qualifications of elders are qualifications of good Christians. Now, obviously there are a few exceptions. You don't have to be a man to be a Christian. A woman can be a Christian. Not everybody has to be apt to teach in the sense that elders are to be apt to teach, as Titus chapter 1. You may have varying abilities of that. We talked about that this morning. Now, you don't have to have children or be married. There are some qualifications that one may not, that are not qualifications, or the qualifications specifically of elders, but the vast majority of qualifications of elders are qualifications that means you're being a good Christian. And that sets an example to us. You look at their example and say, that's the example we need to follow. What are the responsibilities that elders have towards the local church? Well, they're to examine themselves in the flock, shepherd or feed the flock, set an example for the flock. Number 4, go to 1 Thessalonians 5, they are to admonish the flock. And we urge you, brethren, to acknowledge those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord. Now, I'm going to pause for just a moment before we go on. I mentioned this earlier. We're going to see a variety of terms used in elders. Those who are over you in the Lord. Who's he talking about? That's elders. That are those that have the responsibility over you. Those who are over you in the Lord and admonish you. So he says, those over you in the Lord, they admonish you. That's part of their job, is admonishing. Well, what does that mean? To admonish means to counsel about avoidance or cessation of an improper course of conduct, to admonish, to warn, or to instruct. So when we talk about admonishing, if you have a New King James, your footnote would say instruct or warn. We're talking about counseling about avoidance or cessation of an improper course of action or conduct. They're warning you, admonishing you, here's what you need to avoid, and here's how you don't need to live, but instead, here's the kind of life you need to be living. A.T. Robertson's another lexicographer. You perhaps have his material, word pictures in the New Testament. He takes a look at those words, and in his material, he says this word admonish means putting sense in the heads of people. That's what it means. To admonish or instruct, you're instructing them in a way that you're putting sense into their heads. You're teaching them how to be sensible and to make these kinds of decisions to live faithfully. So you admonish or warn them. But how's that done? How do elders admonish, or how do elders warn? How do they, as you put sense in the heads of people, as A.T. Robertson said? Well, first and foremost, we already talked about this, but that's done by setting a proper example. When elders set an example of how to live, here's how you live, the kinds of things you do, and the kinds of things you don't do. Setting that example is a way of warning and instructing others, here's how you need to live. They've set an example. Let me tell you another way that's done, though, is by selecting sound teachers and preachers to publicly instruct. How do you make sure people are warned about the things they need to be warned about? Make sure that whether the elders are teaching, or one of the elders is the preacher, or whether when they talk to the preacher, that the kinds of things that needs to be warned about are being dealt with and warned about, that they're being instructed on so that others live right. But then the third way is sometimes it requires giving personal instructions to each member as needed. Maybe you've got somebody over here, maybe they're not in sin yet, but you can tell they're headed down a bad path. And the elders pull them aside and say, we want to talk to you, and you warn them, you're headed in a bad direction. That's a way of admonishing or warning or instructing. Sometimes you find out they're in that path when it's too late, and you have to warn them. You've got to come back from that. Sometimes there's preemptive warnings before things have become an issue. Excuse me. But the elders admonish or instruct and warn by setting an example, by making sure that the teaching and preaching that's publicly instructed is sound, and by giving personal instruction to those as needed. What are the responsibilities of elders to the local church? Well, they're to examine themselves in the flock, Acts 20:28. Shepherd and feed the flock, 1 Peter 5 and in verse 1, Acts 20 and in verse 28. Set an example for the flock in 1 Peter 5:3. Admonish the flock, 1 Thessalonians 5:12. Rule and exercise oversight. Rule and exercise oversight. Go to Hebrews 13 with me. We're going to look for a few passages here. Hebrews 13 and in verse 17. Obey those who rule over you and be submissive. Now, we're going to come later on and we're going to talk about our responsibility towards elders, and we got to come back to this passage and talk about our responsibility to obey those who rule over us and be submissive. But right now we're focusing on their responsibility, and the responsibility of elders is to rule over you. That word rule means to rule with the implication of providing direction and leadership, to rule, to order, to govern, or government rule, Ioannidis says. Paul in 1 Timothy 5 would talk about elders who rule well. And so the idea is they rule over you. But again, this idea of ruling over, and we'll get to this in a minute in 1 Peter 5, but it's not about as lording it over them as if I'm in such a great high position of authority, but they lead and instruct well, directing you with true leadership as to how you need to conduct yourself and how you need to be living. So elders are to rule over you, but there are some limitations on the rule of elders, 1 Peter chapter 5. So go to 1 Peter 5. What are the limitations? Well, first and foremost, 1 Peter chapter 5. Let's look at verse 2. Shepherd the flock of God which is among you. Elders' rule is limited to those at the flock of which they are an overseer. there is, the elders here can't be ruling over another congregation. Right? Each congregation is autonomous in the sense that this church makes the decisions here. And so we could talk about what time we meet or when to meet. Do we meet on a midweek Bible study, maybe Tuesday night or Wednesday night or Thursday night? Or do we want to meet at 9:45 or 9:30? When do we have the Lord's Supper before or after? Those kinds of decisions are made here. When the decision's made here, it's not made for all the churches in the area around. The elders here aren't making decisions for all of the churches. The elders at other congregations aren't making decisions for here. The rule of elders, their oversight is limited to the flock of which they are an overseer. Here's the second thing. Look in verse 2. Serving as overseers not by compulsion, but willingly. There's a willingness to serve. There is a debate over in 1 Timothy chapter 1 whether if a man desires the office of an overseer, he desires a good work, if that's the first qualification. I think it is. We've talked about qualifications of elders before. We talked about that first one. There's a willingness to serve. I was listening to something this last week where somebody said if a man is willing to serve, I'm willing to serve, and he talks about his wanting to serve, we mark him off the list because he seems awfully eager to serve. But then if he's unwilling, if he doesn't show the interest in wanting to serve, we mark him off the list because he's not willing to serve. And it's as they say, it's a catch-22. No matter what he does, it's a bad decision. There's a willingness to serve, not because they want authority and rule, but because they want to help others go to heaven. They understand that with that being an elder comes great responsibility, but they're willing to do so. Not for dishonest gain, but eagerly. It's not for dishonest gain. It's not for gain of power, nor trying to use it for financial gain, but they eagerly serve. And then finally, nor as being lords as those entrusted to you. Elders aren't trying to lord their position as elders over others. Again, it's not about being in a position with authority. It's about ruling and ruling well. 1 Timothy 5:17. It's something that comes with great responsibility. We talked about this morning, the statement of who much is given, much is expected. Elders fill a great role in the Lord's church, and because of that, they give an account for what they've done, not only for themselves, but in leading the flock of God. And they exercise rule and oversight, not as lords, but responsibly leading the flock. Here's another one. Watch out for the souls of the flock. Hebrews 13:17. Obey those who rule over you and be submissive, for they watch out for your souls. So there are three things here in Hebrews 13:7. Look at Hebrews 13:7 again. For they watch out for your souls as those who must give an account. Let them do so with joy and not with grief, for that would be unprofitable for you. So here's the first thing. They have their work. Their work is watch out for your souls. If you think about what Paul says in Acts 20 about taking heed to yourself, make sure you're living right, take heed to the flock. He said, from among you there'll be ravenous wolves. Now, in the sense, from among you, in the sense that from among brethren there would be ravenous wolves. But I think the point in Acts 20 is even among the eldership at Ephesus, there was going to become ravenous wolves. So those of you who are faithful, you watch out and watch out for that. It's the jobs of elders to watch out for the souls of the flock. Now, there are a number of ways in which that's done, but in particular, in making sure the teaching is what they need. I mentioned it, I think when we were in Matthew 18 in our Bible study, that when I was working with Donnie Rader, that Donnie mentioned to me, he said that when he was in Louisville, one of the elders always sat at the front pew, and he didn't understand why. And finally, one day he was told why, and that is that on more than one occasion, somebody had stood in the pulpit and publicly taught error. And he got up, being one of the elders, and he dealt with that. That's his responsibility, watching out for the souls. And he wanted to make sure that if error was taught, that it was responded to quickly so people knew what the truth was. So he sat on the front pew, so if it ever happened again, he'd be quicker to respond. He wouldn't have to walk all the way from the back or the middle or wherever he used to sit. Now, I bring that up for this reason. The reason he sat there, the reason he was getting ready is because he knew his responsibility was watch out for the souls of the flock, and if error is taught, he needed to deal with that and deal with that quickly. Now, it may be him answering that error himself. It may be him simply saying that error has been taught, giving some explanation, and on one occasion saying, Brother so-and-so, I think they had a couple of preachers at the time, Brother so-and-so, one of the preachers there, he's going to deal with that on Sunday morning in more detail. That preacher didn't know at that time he was dealing with it on Sunday morning until one of the elders said he's dealing with that on Sunday morning. But he brought it up because it needs to be dealt with. He's watching for the souls. You watch for the souls that they're watching for those who maybe aren't attending like they need to. Or maybe they're attending, but there's signs of other things that they're going spiritually apathetic. Or maybe those who they may be attending, but spiritually you can tell they're starting to wander away from God. Elders are watching for their souls to make sure they're faithful. Now, here's how serious the work is. As those who must give account, elders not only give an account for what they've done and how they lived, they not only give an account for how they've raised their children and how they've been in their family, but they give an answer for how they've been serving as elders in the Lord's church. They have to give an account for that. Have they watched out for souls? Have they met their responsibilities or not? For that, they must give an account. The attitude behind that is let them do so with joy and not with grief. Not that there's not times there's sorrow and stress in the work of an elder. As elders do their job, there's going to be times that things may get them down as you're dealing with people who may not be faithful. There'll be times where there's grief in that sense, but they're glad to do the work to serve and to help the Lord's church in any way that they can. So what are the responsibilities of elders? To examine themselves in the flock, to shepherd and feed the flock, set an example for the flock, admonish the flock, rule and exercise oversight, and watch out for your souls. One more point on this, and then we'll talk about our responsibilities as members towards elders. Pray for the sick and see to their needs. Now, we saw this morning, so I'm not going to deal with this in detail. That's a responsibility every one of us has, Matthew 25:36, and in verse 43. We saw that in our Bible study this morning, but specifically James 5 mentions elders. Is anyone among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church. And let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. Why specifically the elders? There's some debate. Perhaps because if elders are meeting the qualifications they need to be, that's prayers of righteous people offered on your behalf. But elders specifically are mentioned. While again, it's a responsibility of everyone, elders are specifically mentioned in James chapter 5. So, I know that's a hurried look. We could spend a lot more time on any one of those, but we've got a lot of responsibilities that the elders have towards the local church to cover. So we've seen the organization of the church. It's elders or bishops, deacons, and saints. The responsibilities that elders have towards the church. Now let's talk about the responsibilities that the church has towards elders. What are our responsibilities as members? You may be sitting there saying, I understand the responsibility that elders have. I understand what they need to be doing. I'm a member. What's my responsibility? Well, your responsibility first and foremost is recognize the elders. Look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and in verses 12 and 13. 1 Thessalonians 5, 12 and 13. And we urge you, brethren, to recognize those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord. Again, we've already established that's elders. And admonish you. Verse 13. And to esteem them very highly in love for the word's sake. We'll talk about that second part in a minute in verse 13. But verse 12, he says to recognize the elders. He says, we urge you, brethren, New King James, to recognize those who rule over you in the Lord. The King James says, we beseech you, brethren, to know them which are over you in the Lord. The NASB says, we request of you, brethren, that you appreciate those who have charge over you in the Lord. And the ESV says, we ask you, brothers, to respect those who are over you in the Lord. We must recognize, know, respect the elders. What does that mean? Well, it means that we must know who they are, be familiar with them. Go to John 10. Now, John 10, Jesus is talking about him being the good shepherd, but Jesus uses a point about a shepherd and the sheep, and the Bible uses that analogy, not just of the Lord to all those that are his servants, but it refers to elders as those who are shepherding the flock. And it says in John 10 and in verse 2, but he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. The sheep know the shepherd. If elders are to shepherd the flock, that's what part of being an elder is, shepherding the flock, then the sheep, those of the flock, need to recognize or know the elders. So we know them in the sense we are familiar with them. For example, I've known of places where, I did some work at a place several years ago, they said that anytime they've appointed elders, deacons as well, but they've appointed elders, they would hand out a sheet to all the members there for names, and there would be 3 things to fill in. Number 1, I believe so-and-so was qualified. It had list qualifications and says so-and-so is qualified. And so you think so-and-so is qualified to serve as an elder, or again, they did the same thing when they appointed deacons. The second one was, I don't think there's any man that's qualified to serve in that capacity. Anybody other than those already serving. And the third one was, I'm either a new convert or haven't been here long enough to know. Well, why would that be important? If somebody moves into an area they don't yet know enough, they will know enough in placing membership to become somewhat familiar with the current eldership, but you go to appoint somebody else, they might not say, I don't know so-and-so well enough to know whether they're able to serve or not. I think maybe they are, but I don't know. They're not familiar with them. We need to be familiar with the elders. But also, recognizing them means we recognize and appreciate the work they do. Again, we just talked extensively about the work that elders have. It is a difficult task that elders have in overseeing the flock. It's not always an easy job in overseeing the flock. There are difficulties that come with it, and part of recognizing the elders is recognizing and appreciating the role they fill and what they have to do. What is our responsibility as members towards the elders? Well, recognize the elders, number 1. Number 2, esteem them very highly in love. 1 Thessalonians 5:13, esteem them very highly in love for their work's sake. Be at peace among yourselves. So, first is to esteem. What does that mean? It means to lead the mind through a reasoning process to a conclusion, and so to think or to estimate, Vincent says. Vine says it means to lead before the mind. Thayer says that as it's used in 1 Thessalonians 5:13, it means to consider, to deem, to account, to think, or to esteem one exceedingly. So you come to recognize, to think about, and to esteem them because of the work that they do. So what are the descriptions of that esteem? How do we esteem them? Well, first, you esteem them very highly because of the role they have to fill. Secondly, you esteem them in love. Their love for you and your love for them and for their souls and the work, or their love for your soul and your love for them and their soul and the work that they do. And it's done for their work's sake. Again, it's not an easy task, and you esteem them for the role they fill and the work that they have to do. What is the responsibility that members have towards elders? Well, number 1, recognize them. Number 2, esteem them very highly. Number 3, be subject or obey them. Go to Hebrews 13:17 again. Hebrews chapter 13 and in verse 17. In Hebrews 13 and in verse 17, it reads, obey those who rule over you and be submissive, for they watch out for your souls as those who must give account. We went to that passage earlier and said that they have oversight. That's why you're to obey those who rule over you. But now let's go to the other side of it. What he's instructing them is not about elders who rule, but about obeying those who rule over you and being submissive. Now, what that means is, when the elders make a decision, as long as God's law is not violated, we submit to that. If the elders announced tonight that we've decided we're going to have every service in the morning, or they announced that they've decided we're going to start meeting instead of Wednesday on Tuesday, or we're going to move our service to 6:30 or whatever, we may think, well, why are we doing that? May not agree. They've made a decision. They're the ones that rule. Truth is not at stake. We must submit to that. We may not always agree with every decision they make, particularly in matters of judgment. But again, as long as truth is not violated, we must obey and submit to that decision. As long as truth is not at stake, then you are to obey and submit to the rule of elders. So, when they make a decision, again, there's matters of judgment that are made. There's lots of decisions they have to make. It is expected that as long as truth is not at stake, to be subject or obey. What is the responsibility of members to elders? Recognize the elders, esteem them very highly, be subject or obey. Number 4, be at peace among yourselves. 1 Thessalonians 5:13. And to esteem them very highly in love for their work's sake, be at peace among yourselves. It's found in the same context of 12 and 13 about the responsibilities towards elders, where he then follows it up by saying, be at peace among yourselves. It is difficult for elders to lead a flock when the sheep are always fighting. I want you to imagine for a minute, again, as we use the illustration of, as the Bible uses the illustration of a shepherd leading his sheep and the flock for elders. Can you imagine if you're a shepherd and you've got sheep out there that are fighting and you're trying to lead the sheep wherever they need to go to graze for their food, and as you're trying to lead them out, you've got sheep that are always fighting and you got to keep going back there and separating them, and then you try to lead the sheep, and about a minute later the same two sheep at the back start fighting again, and you got to go back there and separate and sort of referee, get them apart, and then you try to lead the sheep and you get a few more feet and those sheep start fighting again. You think, well, that shepherd's never going to get them to the field he needs to get them to. Elders are to shepherd the flock of God, and the members need to be at peace. It's hard for elders to lead when the sheep are always fighting. If the sheep are always fighting with one another, the elders are going to be spending more time having to referee between people than leading with important decisions. In fact, I want you to go to Acts 6 with me. When the church is at peace, the elders can devote themselves to what's truly important. Now, Acts chapter 6, we're not talking about elders that were here in this case. This is actually the apostles, and there's not deacons in the sense of 1 Timothy chapter 3. These men were appointed to a special work. They were deacons in a sense, in that they were servants. But the reason in Acts 6, and the same would be true when we talk about elders and their responsibilities, but we will give ourselves, the apostles said, continually to prayer and to the ministry of the word. The problem was there was a complaint that there was the Hellenists being neglected in the daily distribution. And the apostles had more important matters than if the Hellenist widows got their money. They needed to be taken care of, but there were more important spiritual issues they needed to deal with. The apostles couldn't be dealing with the tables and at the same time be dealing with preaching the word. So what do? They have the people, the congregation pick 7 men there that serve in some sense as a deacon. Again, I don't think it's the sense as 1 Timothy 3 talks about deacons, but they were a servant in some sense in that they waited the tables in Acts chapter 6 so that the apostles could devote themselves to what's truly important. Well, here's the reason I bring that up. If the congregation's at peace with one another, then the elders can be focusing on what's being taught, making sure the truth is taught, making sure when they're scheduling somebody for a meeting it's being taught, or whoever's preaching, or the Bible class. But if the sheep are always fighting and the elders are having to go separate the sheep, that's taking time away from what's most important. And that is spiritual matters that need to be decided. So one of the responsibilities we have is to be at peace among ourselves. 2 more points this morning and the lesson will be yours. What's the responsibility of members towards elders? Well, remember and imitate their faith. Hebrews 13:7. Remember those who rule over you and have spoken the word of God to you, whose faith follow. Consider the outcome of their conduct. We already saw that elders set an example in 1 Peter 5, and now what Paul is saying here is you follow or the Hebrew writer in Hebrews is saying is you follow the example they've set. Much to the point that Paul made in Philippians 3 when he said, "Brethren, join in following my example and note those who so walk as you have us for a pattern." When elders who rule well, who are serving, meet the qualifications God has given and are serving well, they set an example to follow for the flock. And so, that if they set an example that should be followed, then follow their example. That's why Paul, or the Hebrew writer said, whose faith follow. When they're going in the right direction, follow them in the right direction. So what are the responsibilities that members have towards elders? Well, recognize the elders, esteem them very highly, be subject to or obey them, be at peace among yourselves, remember and imitate their faith, and finally, this one's a little bit longer, but do not receive an accusation against an elder but by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, that statement is true about in any situation hearing 2 or 3 witnesses, but Paul, particularly in 1 Timothy 5, is dealing with that. The fact is, we don't need to believe everything that we hear. In Matthew 11:19, Jesus, in talking about the Pharisees and their reaction to him and to John, they said of the Son of Man, he came eating and drinking. They say, look, he's a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So what if you listen to what people were saying about Jesus? You'd say, well, he's a glutton, he's a winebibber, and he associates with terrible people. That's what they were saying about him. In Proverbs 18:17, it says, the first one to plead his cause seems right until his neighbor comes and examines him. Sometimes when in dealing with conflict, whether elders are dealing with conflict or dealing with conflict with children or in the workplace, if you're in a position of authority in the workplace, somebody will come and tell you one story and the second person comes and tells you a different story, and you got to find out what the truth is. Can't believe everything you hear. The reason I bring all that up to say is this. When Paul said in 1 Timothy 5, do not receive an accusation against an elder except for 2 or 3 witnesses, the point is, before you believe an accusation against an elder, make sure there's evidence to support it. I was listening this last week to some classes that a preacher did on leadership. They had a Bible study where they were looking out to talk about men that may not be qualified yet, but down the road be qualified. And they did a series of studies on what it means to be a leader in leadership. And in that class, he would give some scenarios, real scenarios that he'd either dealt with as a preacher and elder, or he knew those who had dealt with. And one of the scenarios that he'd heard of was there was an eldership where somebody came and said one of them wasn't qualified, and come to find out it had to do with the decision that they had made, that they perceived that person to be the ringleader in, I think in withdrawing from family or something like that. And but it was one person coming and making, or one family coming and making an accusation. Now, maybe more than 2 or 3 people, but they all came from the same source. And when they investigated, everybody else did not think to qualify. Somebody may come and say, I saw brother so-and-so do this or say this, but there may not be evidence for it. The point that is made is you believe the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Elders can sin. Everybody sins. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, Romans chapter 3. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 12, therefore let him who thinks he stand take heed lest he fall. Elders can sin, and when they sin, they must be dealt with. But the point that's made here is you don't believe every accusation that's made, but establish a testimony on the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. Elders and the local church. It's a lot of material I know we've covered this morning, but it's about our responsibility towards elders and elders' responsibility towards the church. What is that? Well, number one, we looked at the organization of the local church, how God said the church is to be organized. That's with elders and deacons and saints, Philippians 1 and in verse 1. We looked at the responsibilities that elders have to the local church. They're to examine themselves and the flock, Acts 20 and in verse 28. They're to shepherd and feed the flock. They're to set an example for the flock, 1 Peter 5:3, to admonish the flock, 1 Thessalonians 5:12, to rule and exercise oversight, to watch out for the souls of the flock, and to pray for those who are sick and see to their needs. Then we saw the responsibilities that we as members have towards those who serve as elders. We recognize them. We esteem them very highly in love. We're subject to them. We're at peace among ourselves. We remember and imitate their faith, and we do not receive an accusation except at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. That's the responsibilities that elders have towards the church and the church has towards elders. But as we come to a close now this morning, it may be that there's one or more present who may have never responded in obedience to the gospel. If you're here this morning and you've heard the word of God, you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, do not repent of your sin, confess your faith in Him, being buried in the waters of baptism, rising and walking in the newness of life, having your sins forgiven, having the hope of heaven when life on earth is over. Maybe you're here and you've done that, but you say somewhere along the line, I've not been as faithful as I need to be. Sin of a private nature, you can take it a little privately in prayer. But if it's a sin of a public nature, you desire the prayers of the congregation, we'll gladly pray with you and for you, for God to forgive you. No matter what your need is, if we can assist you in any way, would you not go forward right now as together we stand and as we sing. Every tear,